This is a look at rape as a civil rights issue, and specifically looking at the history of white against black sexual violence against black women. If you want to know more about it, I recommend Danielle McGuire's book, At the Dark End of the Street. Testifying. There have been black women testifying about white sexual abuse for a very long time. But in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a tendency to try to be delicate, I guess would be a way to put it, about this, because there was fear of extending the idea of black women as promiscuous, the idea that this is going to destroy your own reputation. But by the 1940s, something seemed to be shifting. And they had testimony about white men raping black women, flooding into the NAACP offices, going to black newspapers, and also going to the Justice Department. We colored women are tired of such things, Mrs. Joy B. Jones proclaimed in a 1947 letter to the NAACP. And so you have this turning of the moment. We're now going to look at a series of cases, starting the Reekie Taylor case in 1944, and sort of see how things did and didn't change. There was a small town in Georgia where Reekie Taylor lived. She was walking home from church at midnight with two friends. She was a sharecropper and a mother. They were passed multiple times by a car with a group of white young men. 7 men armed with knives and guns got out, claimed that Taylor was guilty of cutting a white boy and that she must come with them. After that, she tried to run, but they forced her into the car at gunpoint. 6 of the men gang raped her, blindfolded her, and then dumped her on the side of the road, leaving her to walk home. The thing is that Reekie Taylor then went home and she told her husband, but she also told the sheriff. But the sheriff basically claims to do an investigation, but really doesn't do anything, despite the fact that he saw Reekie Taylor immediately after the rape. So they go to the NAACP in Alabama, and Rosa Parks, yes, that Rosa Parks, is appointed to investigate the case. She goes to the town, forms a committee, and begins to demand justice. The thing is, what this means for Reekie Taylor is that she's receiving death threats. Her home was firebombed. They had to go live with relatives, and she was afraid to go into the town for fear of what might happen to her. Black papers, however, quickly picked up this case and made it another example of Southern injustice. And there was a campaign in New York City providing funds to flood the South with flyers and create a letter-writing campaign to push the governor to force the courts to indict Taylor's attackers. And it became an issue beyond that because, of course, the news got to the black troops who were fighting in World War II. And actually, you have the editorial director of the Army News urging Governor Sparks to act. If this pamphlet reaches any considerable number of Negroes in our armed services, and I have no doubt it will greatly affect their efficiency. This, of course, will be very bad for the war effort, for it is senseless to fight fascism abroad if fascistic influences are to be protected at home. And so he asked for Sparks to give a statement that assures Negro soldiers that he will see to it that the degenerate and ruthless persons who attacked Mrs. Taylor are brought to justice and severely punished. Sparks ends up having to do something. So what he does is he makes sure that there's a grand jury to investigate and indict. Basically what this means is that they hold the grand jury hearing, Reiki Taylor testifies, but there's no attempt to arrest or in any way bring to justice the white men who committed the rape. This gets seen as by many local Alabamians as an example of a potential Scottsboro case. You have anti-communists arguing that this is yet another example of communist influence. The governor does send investigators, but basically the sheriff tells them that Taylor was a prostitute and a troublemaker, and her husband was lazy, even though other local whites testified to Reiki Taylor's good reputation. So in the end, nothing gets done, and the NAACP realizes that they have to move on to other cases. For Reiki Taylor and her family, however, it means that they have to leave their town and move to Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks helps them with this and set up new lives because it's not safe for them to remain in their small town. Betty Jean Owens, Tallahassee, Florida, 1959. On May 2nd, 1959, 4 white men in Tallahassee made a pact to go out, as one of their friends testified in court later, and get a, well, you know what the word was, girl. They armed themselves with shotguns and switchblades and crept up behind a car that was parked along the road. And what this was there had been a big ball at the local HBCU and had been sort of at the party, and then they were parked out there doing what couples do. The white men come, they have their shotguns, they force the students out of their car. They're dressed in full formal gowns and tuxedos. They force the black men to kneel while they held the two black women at knife point. When Betty Jean Owens began to cry, they slapped her and told her to shut up or she would never get home again. They then ordered the black men back into the car and told them to leave. One of the girls, Edna Richardson, manages to run away and get away from there, but Betty Jean Owens couldn't escape. And they raped her at knife point. The men who were sent away find the other girl, Richardson, pick her up, and they go to the local police station to report the crime. And this is where it gets, I guess, luck. There's a 19-year-old intern who's in charge that day, not the local police chief or any of the local police chief's men. And he takes this very seriously. And so he agrees to search for Owen and the attackers and managed to capture the 4 men after a high-speed chase through Tallahassee and found Owens bound and gagged. Utterly unconcerned after the arrest, the 4 white men confessed to what they had done. The students at the local HBCU, FAMU, had previously led a bus boycott, but this issue brings out all of their anger. And at first they decide to have an armed march downtown, and then they change that to a unity gathering on campus. 1,500 students gather, where the president of the student government says that he would not sit idly by and see our sisters, wives, and mothers desecrated, and that they were going to petition the governor and everyone else for a speedy and impartial trial. The next day, more than 1,000 people gather at the University Quadrangle with signs, songs, and prayers. Student protesters held signs that declared, "It could have been your sister, wife, or mother." They targeted the national news media, trying to get as much attention as possible, and threatened to boycott classes. And as one student explained, Patricia Stephen Dew, We all felt violated, male and female. It was like all of us had been raped. And so this case gathers national attention, and the local authorities can't quite push it away, and so they actually hold a trial. They held the grand jury, called the grand jury into session. More than 200 Black people were in attendance in the audience. The men were indicted. They all pled innocent, and they were sent to jail by the judge to await trial. Before a crowd of 400 at the trial, Owens described what had happened to her, her injuries, that she was under treatment for severe depression as a result. The defense lawyers grilled Owens, demanding if she enjoyed it, why she didn't try harder to get away, repeatedly asked if she was a virgin, but she refused to answer that question. And they had medical testimony saying that she had injuries from sexual intercourse. The defense tried to deny force, so they admitted that they had used a shotgun and a switchblade and gagged Owens. They tried to argue that they were drunk, that they were poor and poorly educated, and then tried to claim they were good boys who couldn't commit rape, blaming Owen as a Jezebel. The prosecutor asked, what would you do if these were Black men who had been brought to trial? And amazingly enough, they convicted them, and they were actually sent to prison, which was a huge change. However, the law for rape in Florida held the death penalty, and the jury recommended mercy, so they did not receive the death penalty, which a Black man almost certainly would have in that case. Some whites were furious at this conviction, saw it as a communist NAACP plot. On the other hand, though, Betty Jean Owens said this: I've lived to see the day where white men would really be brought to trial for what they did. And this isn't just a one-time thing. Other convictions followed in the following years of white men who had raped Black women in southern states. In 1965 in Mississippi, they had their first conviction since Reconstruction of a white man who was sent to prison. Joanne Little. Joanne Little was in eastern North Carolina. She was a young woman who had grown up in difficult circumstances. She had been arrested and jailed for theft and other crimes. One morning, the jailer was found in her cell in his socks, but otherwise naked from the waist down, semen trailing down his leg, holding an ice pick, a lady's nightgown on the floor, bra hanging from the cell door, and Joanne Little was gone. She spent a week in hiding before contacting an attorney and surrendering to the State Bureau of Investigation. By this point in time, rape had actually become a public issue. And by 1971, it was something that white feminists were actually calling for attention about as well. There was a task force formed in 1973 by the National Organization for Women, and there were rape crisis centers and rape hotlines, which didn't exist before this, were being founded across the country. When it comes to how this affects Joanne's trial, the prosecution portrays Little as wanton, stereotypical Black women. But the defense says, look, these guys are just a bunch of backward rednecks in North Carolina. They're still following Jim Crow, and what Joanne Little did, she did in self-defense. The defense appealed to women's groups, and the story spread through feminist circles and publication. Angela Davis spoke out against it. The Women's Legal Defense Fund, the Feminist Alliance Against Rape, the Rape Crisis Center, the National Black Women Feminist Organization, and the National Organization for Women mobilized national support and engaged in fundraising. NAACP, however, did not get involved because they didn't like dealing with sex cases, though local chapters helped to raise money. And more than that, there was a strong activity by Black women. Rosa Parks actually helped to found the Joanne Little Defense Committee in Detroit, inspiring a student rally and fundraising, and there were similar organizations in a variety of cities. In North Carolina, African American women began organizing on Little's behalf. And a lot of them saw this as a continuation of the civil rights fight and responding to a long history of sexual violence. As one of the women said, I felt like Joanne could have been one of my daughters and was caught up in a situation in which she really had no control. They managed to change the venue of the trial, got it moved to an urban court, and the defense lawyers basically stood there and at the trial put the case in its historical context, saying that Southern police officers had a long history of sexually assaulting and sexually harassing Black women in their custody. In the Beaufort County Jail where Joanne had been, they said Black women were wholly unprotected. Officers kept a camera trained on female prisoners at all times, watching them or peeping at them while they showered, changed clothes, and used the toilet. Little testified that when she wanted to tie up a blanket to block the TV monitor and protect her privacy while she was naked, officers came and took her blanket away. When she wanted to take a shower, she had to call the jailer and have him turn the water on, and then he'd stand there and watch as she showered. They also brought in evidence of other kinds of sexual abuse that had happened in the jail, that this was just one in a larger pattern of abuse that was taking place. Joanne Little, who speaks out about the details of what had happened and how he had come, basically bringing her gifts of the nightgown, and basically telling her that she had to comply, that she actually submitted to his rape to start with, but terrified because he had the ice pick in his hand, she reached out for it and it fell. He grabbed for it. I grabbed for it. And she said, I got the ice pick first and struck at him each time he came at me. The prosecutors tried to argue that Joanne Little was essentially a prostitute and had consented to what was happening to her as sex. But she basically, and the defense supported her, argued that she was in a position where she had no power and she had to strike out to defend herself. The jury voted unanimously to acquit.